before the world was carved into continents, before the prophets were born, before anyone called anything God, there were names too ancient to be written and faces too sacred to be drawn. These were not the gods of white marble and stained glass windows. These were black gods, cloaked in mystery, crowned in starlight, older than time and yet erased from it. You won't find them in the books they let you read. Not in Sunday school, not in the temples, not in the dusty pages of approved history. But they existed in whispers passed between grandmothers and griots, in the symbols etched into cave walls long before a Bible or Quran ever existed. These gods did not descend from the heavens on chariots of fire. They rose up from the soil, walked among the people, and breathed the same air. They were gods of earth, of blood, of rhythm, and sun. They were not distant. They were present, intimate, necessary. There was Atunra, not to be confused with Ra, though he too shined. Atunra was said to have birthed the cycles of time itself, dividing chaos into moments so humans could learn to dream. He didn't demand sacrifice. He demanded memory. And memory, it turns out, was the first thing stolen. Then there was Makeda, not the Queen of Sheba the textbooks pretend to acknowledge, but a deeper force who danced between dimensions, guiding the souls of the unborn. She held a mirror to creation and whispered, "You are divine, but they will convince you otherwise." They were gods of balance, of order and disruption, of storm and soil. They didn't rule from thrones in the clouds. They lived in the drumbeat, in the hum of the bees, in the spiral of a seashell. And most of all, they lived in black skin, but their images were shattered, their temples burned, their names dragged through centuries of silence. And when the conquerors came dressed in steel, waving flags soaked in the blood of innocence, they didn't just kill the people, they killed the gods, or so they thought. Because you can erase a statue, you can ban a language, you can burn a library, but how do you kill something that still lives in bone and breath? Their stories are still here, hidden in folk songs, woven into quilts, disguised as saints, repackaged as demons, mispronounced in modern tongues. They are still with us. You just have to know where to look and what to unlearn. And if all of this feels unfamiliar, maybe that's the point. Maybe unfamiliar is just another word for forbidden. Because once you start pulling this thread, you'll realize something terrifying and liberating at the same time. The gods they told you to fear look exactly like the people they taught you to hate. And if that truth echoes somewhere inside you, then keep listening, because the shadows we're about to walk through aren't empty. They're crowded with names that once shaped the stars. Long before crowns were forged in gold, the first throne was carved from obsidian volcanic glass formed deep within the earth's fire. It didn't sit in a palace. It rested in a cave, surrounded by symbols no modern scholar can translate. Because those symbols weren't written for the eyes, they were written for the soul. This throne belonged to Ibokai, a god not of war or wind, but of memory and inheritance. His skin shimmered like oil in the sun. His voice, thunder wrapped in velvet. The myths say Ibokai could hold your entire bloodline in a single glance. One look, and he would remind you of who you were, and more dangerously, who you could become. But his worship wasn't allowed to last, because Ibokai gave people something empires fear most: identity. Not the kind printed on paper or wrapped in borders, but the identity that lives in marrow, the kind that can't be colonized. When the desert priests of newer gods arrived, they found Ibokai's followers singing his name into the earth, not begging for salvation, not asking for favors, just remembering. That terrified them. So they did what all conquerors do. They buried his name beneath stone, renamed his rituals, and told the people that memory was a sin. What followed wasn't just physical conquest. It was spiritual warfare. Whole pantheons were whitewashed. Gods were either demonized or downgraded to spirits. The throne of obsidian, broken, the cave, sealed with salt and lies. And in its place, they built altars to foreign names carved in pale stone gods who didn't look like the people they claimed to save. But fragments of Ebokai remain. You see him when an elder tells stories with more truth than textbooks. You hear him in the heartbeat of a djembe drum, steady and defiant. You feel him in the moments when you remember something you were never taught but somehow always knew. You were not meant to kneel to him. You were meant to sit beside him. That was the original covenant, not of dominance, but of dignity. And dignity, like obsidian, does not shatter easily. It may be buried, but it never forgets its shape. Ask yourself this: why would an empire spend so much time destroying a god it claimed wasn't real? Because something buried that deep still burns. And as the fire of Ebokai flickers back into collective memory, you begin to see the cracks in the stories you were told. What if the gods they replaced weren't pagan mistakes, but deliberate erasures? What if the darkness they told you to fear, the blackness, wasn't evil but sacred? If so, the world you thought you knew is already trembling, because the obsidian throne may be gone, but the God who sat on it is waking. Before there were alphabets, before priests pressed ink onto parchment, the sky had a language, and those who listened closely could understand it not with their ears, but with their bones. It spoke in lightning, it whispered through eclipse, it sang through wind that carried dust from one continent to another, as if reminding the earth that everything was once one. This sky language had no vowels, no consonants. It moved through symbols, living glyphs, pulsing patterns traced by fireflies and constellations alike. The people who first understood this divine dialect weren't prophets or scribes. They were stargazers, farmers, mothers, children. Their ancestors had danced beneath a night so dark it glittered, and they knew that stars were not just lights, but messages, and the messengers wore black skin. One such messenger was Nazaria, the goddess of celestial rhythm, not a goddess of sun or moon alone, but of how they moved when they met, and what they whispered when no one else was awake. Her followers said that she taught the world the difference between fate and rhythm. Fate is fixed, she'd say, but rhythm you can dance with. Every movement of Nazaria's hand shaped a season. Her breath created monsoons, and her laughter formed spiral galaxies. She didn't demand temples. She asked only for attention, for stillness, for reverence to the sky, not through worship, but through observation. And for a time, people listened. They built stone circles that marked solstices to the second. They crafted beads that mirrored planetary alignments. They told stories where gods didn't punish, but participated, playing, guiding, reminding. Nazaria was always among them, sometimes in the wind, sometimes in the birth of twins, sometimes in the silence before rain. But then came the rewrite, a new kind of religion, colder, disconnected, terrified of the feminine divine. And Nazaria, she was labeled a sky demon. Her glyphs were smashed, her rhythms called pagan nonsense. But even silence has an echo, and the sky never stopped speaking. Today, her symbols show up in crop formations no one can explain. Her geometry appears in ancient architecture the textbooks pretend was coincidence. And every time you look up and feel something, a pull, a recognition, a pressure behind your eyes, that's her. tracing a forgotten letter across your soul. Why did they fear her? Because she didn't need priests to translate her. She needed only your attention. She bypassed the middleman. She offered you direct communion. And in a world built on control, direct access is dangerous. So ask yourself, why were you taught to look at the sky and see only emptiness? Why were you trained to fear the night when it was the first cathedral? The language of the sky hasn't died. It's just waiting for someone who remembers how to listen. And Nazaria, she's still dancing. Rivers don't just carve through land, they carve through memory. They hold stories in sediment, whispers in current. And if you've ever stood by one long enough, you've felt it. That pull. The sensation that something ancient is watching, not threatening, but waiting. Not forgotten, but renamed. The Nile, the Congo, the Niger. These are not just rivers, they are veins of the earth. And buried within their names is a god whose story was drowned long before the first missionary arrived. His name was Kumara, the god of the flowing path. He didn't walk, he moved, ever shifting, never stagnant. He was not a builder of cities. He was a reminder that all things move, that no truth can be owned, only honored as it passes through. Kumara wasn't worshipped with temples. He was honored with surrender. His followers would go to the water in silence, asking no questions, bringing no prayers, only listening. They believed that if you truly heard the river, it would tell you where to go, when to leave, and who you were becoming. The water never lied, but when foreign hands came and drew maps with borders, they saw this flow, this refusal to be fixed as chaos. They feared the god who could not be contained, so they built dams, not just of stone and engineering, but of theology. They labeled Kumara a spirit of confusion. They said the river had no god, that only dryness, only structure, only order was divine. And so the flowing path was paved over, literally and spiritually. The people who once sang to Kumara at dawn were forced to kneel to unfamiliar names beneath spires built by conquest. But still the river ran, because water remembers what empires forget. It weeps, but it resists. It yields, but it returns. And even now, the path of Kumara is not lost. It's just hidden in motion. You see him in migration patterns, in floods that reclaim what men thought was theirs, in the quiet rebellion of a person who decides to leave the life they were told was holy, and instead follows something they can't explain, something that feels right. Kumara speaks in detours, in intuition, in dreams that disrupt your plans. He doesn't demand belief. He invites trust, not in him, but in yourself, in the flow you've been taught to ignore. So when your life feels like it's shifting, when the map you were given no longer fits the terrain, ask yourself, are you lost? Or are you finally moving with the current? Because the river never left, and neither did he. Keep following the current, and you'll find that the gods who were buried didn't drown. They just changed direction. There's a trick as old as conquest. When you can't kill a god, rename it, repackage it, paint over it with a friendlier face. And soon, people will forget who they were really praying to, what they were really feeling, what power they once had. That's how Nantanu, the mother of light and root of all healing, became Saint Agnes. That's how Bazil, the thunder-speaking guardian of thresholds, became Archangel Michael. And that's how thousands of black gods were hidden not in the shadows, but in the center of every church, every prayer, every holy day you thought you understood. It wasn't disappearance, it was disguise. Take the halos in medieval paintings, golden discs behind the heads of saints and saviors. You were taught they symbolized holiness, What you weren't told is that these halos came from older depictions of black solar deities, radiant, coiled with energy, their heads encircled by the very sun they commanded. When Rome swallowed Nubia, and when the cross met the crescent, that solar crown was stolen and placed atop paler faces. And what of the Holy Trinity? Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It sounds familiar, but echoes of it stretch back to Kamet, Nura, and Asali, the black triad of fire, word, and breath. Not three beings, but three expressions of one power balance in constant motion. Their stories survived through oral lineages until they were overwritten with patriarchal hierarchy and obedience. But the real deception was subtler, more dangerous. It came with the shift from connection to control. Black gods didn't sit above you. They moved through you. They weren't gatekeepers. They were mirrors. That was the threat. Because if the divine lives in you, then you don't need temples, priests, or permission. You just need memory. And memory, they knew, was harder to kill than a man. So they burned it slowly, over generations, through art, through war, through curriculum, through silence. But even silence leaves clues. Look again at the incense rituals in cathedrals, the swinging of censers, the rhythm of smoke. That's not European. That's a survival of Ashenta, the black goddess of breath and blessing, whose priestesses would cleanse space not with exorcism, but with rhythm. The church took her rituals but forgot her name, or hoped you would. They thought erasure would be final. But what they didn't understand was that black divinity doesn't depend on being remembered by name. It survives in vibration, in gesture, in dream, in rebellion, in the way a mother hums to her child, in the way a people dance even after chains, in the knowing that can't be explained but won't be denied. The gods are still here, under new names, in borrowed robes, but unchanged in essence. So the next time you walk through a place deemed holy, ask yourself what was here before the steeple rose, because when you start to see the disguises, you start to remember what was never truly forgotten. She stares from behind glass cases and candlelight, the Black Madonna. You've seen her before. A dark-skinned woman cradling a child, draped in robes, surrounded by flowers, gold, and incense. They tell you it's Mary. They say it's the Virgin. But what they don't tell you is that she's older than the Bible itself. In shrines across Europe, in Poland, in France, in Spain she appears, painted with skin the color of obsidian, eyes deep as wells, holding an infant who is equally dark. And though pilgrims weep and priests pray, no one quite explains why this Madonna doesn't look like the others, why she doesn't fit the iconography that came with colonial Christianity. They claim it's smoke damage. Centuries of candles have darkened her skin, they say, as if sacred fire selectively alters pigment but not paint, as if we can't see through the lie, the truth. She was never meant to look like the version of Mary we've been sold, because she was never Mary, not originally. She is a Seta Mari, a divine mother worshipped for thousands of years across Africa and the Near East, protector of children, initiator of kings, guardian of the threshold between life and death. She held the codes of both birth and burial. Her image was carried by midwives, warriors, and priestesses alike, and her skin was dark not just because of race, but because of power. In ancient symbolism, black was the color of fertility, of the soil that nourished. The Black Madonna represented not purity in a fragile sense, but wholeness, completeness, the sacred darkness from which all life emerged. When Christian missionaries swept through indigenous lands, they couldn't erase her, so they rebranded her, gave her a new name, inserted her into a sanitized story. But even then, something refused to be whitewashed. Her face remained dark. Her presence remained otherworldly. Her truth refused to die. To this day, entire processions are held in her name. People walk barefoot through towns to see her, to touch the hem of her cloak, to light candles at her feet. They think they're honoring Mary, but they're invoking something deeper, something older, something that remembers. And maybe that's why she makes the church nervous, because every time someone gazes into her face, a question rises. Why is she still here? Because Aseta Mari is a living contradiction, a beautiful flaw in the narrative, a goddess dressed as a saint, a divine mother that no doctrine can fully claim. She reminds us that no matter how many times they rewrite the story, the ink never dries completely. And so the Black Madonna watches, silent, patient, cradling not just a child, but a truth too dangerous to speak aloud. But if you've ever looked into her eyes and felt something stir, something ancient, familiar, and holy, then you already know. She was never theirs to define, and neither are you. Beneath cathedrals that now echo with organ hymns and Sunday sermons, there are stones older than Christianity, foundations that speak in silence, walls built not for the cross, but for the sun. And if you dig not just with shovels, but with questions, you'll find that many of the world's holiest churches were built atop something else: a stolen altar, a buried shrine, a silenced God. This isn't metaphor, it's architecture. Take the Basilica of Our Lady in Zaragoza, Spain. Beneath its marble floors lie the remains of a temple dedicated to an Iberian goddess whose name has been erased. In Ethiopia, the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela were carved down into the earth, but some of those caverns were already sacred long before a chisel ever touched them. Even the Vatican itself, yes, that Vatican was constructed over a necropolis of ancient rituals, layer upon layer, gospel over glyph. It's as if every time a new faith arrived, it did so not by invitation, but by burial. And who were the gods beneath? Their names are barely remembered. Mabara, the guardian of thresholds and sleep. Janu, the mother of flame and renewal. Obek, the one who speaks only in dreams. These were gods not of judgment, but of guidance. Not distant fathers, but present forces. They weren't angry. They weren't jealous. They simply were until someone decided that was too much. So they were hidden, not destroyed, because even empire knows the power of foundations. You don't build over nothing. You build over something sacred, and you claim it as your own. But energy doesn't lie, and you can feel it. That strange heaviness when you enter a cathedral, that chill in the chapel air that can't be blamed on stone or silence, that whisper that makes the back of your neck tingle. You're not alone there. You never were. Because those gods, the black gods, didn't vanish. They sank deeper, into floorboards, into shadow, into breath. And sometimes they stir. They stir when someone kneels for the first time and weeps, not because of doctrine, but because of presence. They stir when a child sings a hymn and doesn't know why the harmony feels older than the words. They stir in confessionals, in baptisms, in funeral bells, not to reclaim their temples, but to remind us that holiness was never theirs alone to begin with. You were taught to worship what stood above, but the sacred has always lived below, in the roots, in the rock, in the voices they tried to bury. So the next time you step into a sanctuary, look down, because the real altar may be beneath your feet, and the God who once stood there is still listening. They wore chains beneath their robes, not iron ones, not always, but chains of silence, of fear, of forced forgetting. Because before the missionaries rewrote the stories, many of the first Christian priests in Africa weren't converts. They were captives, not just physically, but spiritually. They came from bloodlines of seers and oracles, trained in temples where the stars were read like scripture, and healing was an act of harmony. They were sons and daughters of gods who didn't ask for worship, but participation, initiates in sacred lineages where knowledge wasn't memorized, it was inherited, passed in breath, sealed in dreams, protected in ritual. But that kind of power doesn't fit inside a book, so it had to be caged. The colonizers didn't want their gods to compete with older, blacker, bolder ones. So they changed tactics. They didn't kill the priests. They renamed them. The healer became father. The midwife became sister. The shrine became a church, its sacred geometry twisted into Western forms. And the gods, they were buried beneath the sermons. The early black priests were told to forget what they knew, to baptize away their memory, to trade ancestral symbols for crosses made in Rome. Some resisted and vanished. Others pretended. They spoke Latin by day, but whispered the old words at night. Their sermons followed the gospel, but their prayers, their real prayers, still called upon names that made their colonizers uneasy. They became bridges between worlds, or casualties of both, because you can only split yourself in half for so long before you forget which side you're truly on. And yet, some remembered. In certain villages, the communion wine was mixed with herbs sacred to the god of the harvest. In hidden rooms, candles were lit in triads, not to the Trinity of Rome, but to the triad of earth, blood, and breath. Children were taught both creeds, one for school and one for survival. The priest became a prisoner and also a smuggler, smuggling memory in plain sight, hiding the black gods in the folds of vestments, embedding rhythm in hymnals, encrypting power in posture and pause. Not every priest betrayed the old gods. Some became their most brilliant disguises. And even now, you can feel it in those rare moments when a sermon feels too alive, when a ritual vibrates deeper than it should, when a prayer sends chills instead of comfort. That's the prison cracking. That's the God behind the robe, peeking through. So when you see a priest look deeper, not with suspicion, but with knowing, because sometimes the robe is not just a uniform, it's a hiding place. And sometimes the one speaking the gospel is still listening to older voices, voices that remember who they used to be. Relics, bones, fragments of saints encased in gold, skulls beneath altars, fingers sealed in glass. The faithful kneel before them, light candles, whisper prayers. But have you ever stopped to ask, whose bones are these? Really? Because history has a habit of lying, especially when bones are involved. In the rush to build churches across colonized lands, there wasn't always time to ship sacred remains from Europe. So, in more than a few cases, the bones they used were local, indigenous, African, ancient. They dug up elders from unmarked tombs, healers, diviners, even deified ancestors, and called them saints. No names, no ceremonies, just white linen, renamed, repurposed, reburied under stone. And the people who had once sung to these beings in life, they were forced to bow to them in death, under new titles. It was desecration masked as devotion. Consider this. Many of the oldest bones found under European cathedrals don't come from Europe at all. Carbon dating reveals origins tied to ancient Nile civilizations, pre-Christian African tribes, even pre-Islamic Arabia. Their DNA doesn't lie, but the church does. They couldn't risk the truth that the sacred dead they were using to legitimize their new religion were the same ones their religion had tried to erase. So they silenced the story. They gave the bones new names. They changed the faces in the icons but kept the energy intact because they needed power. And power doesn't care about paperwork. But power does remember. There are stories whispered, denied, but persistent of relics that move, that bleed, that speak, statues that weep, bones that won't decay, altars that refuse to stay quiet. The faithful call it miracle, but those who know the old stories recognize something else, a God trying to wake up. Because when a God has been buried, misnamed and prayed to under false pretenses, it doesn't rest peacefully. It waits, it listens, and sometimes it responds. The question is, who are we praying to when we kneel before these relics? The saint, the church's version of the truth, or something far older, deeper, and unacknowledged? There's a reason so many rituals still work, even when the names have changed. It's not the words, it's not the architecture, it's the bones, the vibration, the spirit beneath the altar, the one they thought they could bury. But no one buries a God for long, not when they're made of memory and marrow, not when they're still being touched, kissed, worshipped even under false names. So the next time you walk past a reliquary or kneel before a saint's shrine, pause, look at the bones, ask who they really belong to, because deep down you might already know the God you seek is the one they tried to rename. You think you know the Psalms' poetic verses of comfort and praise. You've heard them sung in churches, whispered at funerals, stitched into tattoos. The Lord is my shepherd. I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills. But what if those words were borrowed, translated, reframed, stripped of their origin like the people who once sang them? Because before David, before Solomon, before Jerusalem's hymns were etched into scrolls, the Psalms were chants, and the chants were older than Scripture. They came from mouths full of stars and dust, from African tongues trained not to recite, but to invoke. The chants didn't praise a God far away. They became the God, the rhythm, the repetition, the drumbeat beneath each line. It wasn't performance, it was possession. You see, long before the Psalms were recorded in Hebrew, there existed the Litany of Medaru, a collection of vibrational invocations sung at twilight across what is now the Sahel. These weren't prayers to a deity. They were remembrances, keys, tones that unlocked the presence of Namara, the black sky goddess of vastness, silence, and potential. Her name meant that which holds everything and yet is held by nothing. Every verse began with breath. Every line echoed in the bones. These chants taught people how to enter alignment with the universe, not beg for mercy within it. When the Hebrews encountered these African rituals during exile and trade, something stuck. They translated what they could. They edited what they couldn't. And thus the Psalms emerged elegant, yes, but hollowed out of their original cadence and context. The voice remained, but the origin was smudged. Ask yourself, why do the Psalms feel so universal, so powerful across cultures and eras? Why do they still move people who don't believe in the God they supposedly describe? Because it's not about belief, it's about frequency, about memory embedded in sound. And some part of you, the oldest part, remembers. The Psalms weren't meant to be read silently. They were meant to be sung while your feet touched earth, meant to be danced as stars aligned overhead, meant to be chanted as fire crackled and elders nodded. They weren't scripture, they were technology. And when they were taken, stripped of the skin that birthed them, and placed in the mouths of empires, the goddess behind them didn't disappear. She simply stepped into the background, silent, listening. But when the right voice speaks the right verse with the original intention, something happens. Not metaphor, realignment. Because those words were never just poems, they were spells. And the power they carry, still black, still present, still waiting. So read the Psalms if you must, but read them with awareness, because every holy verse they handed you was first sung in the dark by someone who looked like you. They say God has no face, that he is beyond form, beyond image, beyond likeness, and yet they painted him, sculpted him, cast him in stained glass and stone, and always, always, he looked the same: white skin, long hair, distant eyes, a face not found in deserts or jungles, a face unfamiliar to the lands where humanity was born. But what if that face isn't neutral? What if that face is a lie? Because before the Vatican, before Michelangelo dipped his brush into myth, before divine became synonymous with pale, there were faces of God carved in obsidian, etched in gold, painted in ochre. Black faces, not symbolic, not allegorical, literal, and not of men alone. God, in the earliest sacred art, was multiple, sometimes woman, sometimes both, sometimes neither, but almost always black. In ancient Ethiopia, the Creator was drawn with skin like rich soil and eyes like stars reflected in water. In Kemet, the divine spark was depicted as emerging from the blackness, not of evil, but of potential. Blackness was the source, the fertile unknown, the place before beginning. Even in the earliest Semitic tribes, the oldest name for God, El Shaddai, was spoken beside dark statues and feminine forms. The divine wasn't feared, it was embodied. So what happened? When Rome made Christianity its empire's weapon, it had to make God reflect itself, not in essence, in image. They understood something simple: if people could see themselves in God, they might never kneel to Rome. So they scraped the murals, destroyed the icons, rewrote the commandments to prohibit what had already been done. No graven images, only after flooding the churches with new ones. And from then on, God had a single face, but even that face cracks. In hidden catacombs beneath ancient churches, black Madonnas and dark-skinned deities still stare from faded walls. In old monasteries untouched by modern paint, the apostles wear Nubian features. In scrolls buried and dismissed as heresy, the divine voice is described as deep, thick, earthborn. The forbidden face was never erased, only hidden. And why does this matter? Because when you worship a God who looks nothing like you, you begin to believe holiness is foreign, that divinity belongs to someone else, that you are a guest in someone else's temple. But when the mask falls, when the forbidden face returns, you remember that you were never made in their image. They tried to make God in theirs, and God has always been bigger, deeper, darker than they dared to admit. So if you've ever closed your eyes in prayer and seen a face not found in paintings, trust it, because the God they fear most might just look like you. They never meant for you to see her, not like that. Angels, in most religious art, are depicted as pale, delicate, almost translucent, feathered beings with childlike faces and Roman noses more decorative than divine. But that's not how they were first seen, and certainly not how they appeared in the lands where angels were felt before they were named. Because once, an angel appeared with skin like copper night, braids coiled tight to her scalp, and eyes that shimmered with stormlight. She didn't descend from clouds, she stepped through veil and vibration. She didn't carry a harp, she carried reminders of who you were before forgetting, of the assignment you agreed to before birth. Her name was Kayashera, the angel of recall. Not recall of memory, but of essence. Her wings weren't feathers, they were fractals of sound, folding and unfolding with each breath. And when she spoke, her voice cracked stone. She was said to appear only to those who were about to be rewritten. those whose stories were being stripped, whose gods were being renamed, whose spirits were being squeezed into foreign shapes. Her job was simple: to remind them, you are not broken, you are being lied to. Ka'ashara shows up in oral histories disguised as dreams. She whispers to children who wake up crying from something they can't explain. She weeps when a language dies, and dances when someone accidentally speaks a word they were never taught but somehow knew. She is not in your Bible, but she is in your bloodstream, and for a time, she was worshipped not as a deity, but as a threshold, a guardian of the soul's memory. In parts of ancient Sudan, griots would invoke her name before telling stories, so that truth would arrive through the mouth without needing to pass through the mind. But her image was dangerous, too strong, too black, too feminine, so she was exiled from the angelic hierarchy and replaced by blonde seraphs with pastel robes. Her story was demoted, her name mispronounced, her power downgraded to metaphor, but she still walks, in the dreams of revolutionaries, in the voice that breaks through during prayer, in the gut feeling that says, this isn't all there is. She doesn't want worship, she wants awakening. And if you're reading this and something inside you stirs something ancient, defiant, and undeniable, then maybe she's already visited you. Maybe she stood by your bed once, waiting, not to protect you from evil, but to protect you from erasure. Ka'ashara doesn't carry swords, she carries mirrors. So when you ask where the angels are, don't look up, look within. Because the divine messenger they tried hardest to forget still remembers you. They told you the story of Moses' plagues, parting seas, the chosen people escaping Egypt under divine fire. But what they never told you is that Egypt wasn't the only place people fled, and the God of Moses wasn't the only one people followed. Hidden beneath layers of sand and silence lies a different exodus, one not written in the Bible but carved into stone by hands that had no need for parchment. It wasn't about escaping slavery, it was about escaping erasure. In what is now the Sahel region, there once stood a confederation of spiritual nations, no flags, no borders, just rhythm and root. These were peoples who worshipped Ombatha, the god of continuance, the force that keeps spirit intact through chaos. When foreign theologies arrived, demanding submission and conformity, entire villages chose to disappear rather than convert. They didn't rebel, they relocated, south, into the jungles, west along the coasts, some say even across the ocean long before boats carried chains. This was the exodus of the remembered. They carried no golden calves. They carried memory, glyphs etched into wood, names whispered into the ears of infants, songs disguised as lullabies, prayers hidden inside recipes and dance. And wherever they went, Ombatha went with them not as a statue, but as an energy, a pulsing presence in migration, in movement, in the refusal to die. To survive was not just biological, it was spiritual, and every step away from conquest was a step toward remembering. But what happened to them? Their stories were never canonized, they weren't turned into scripture. They became ghosts in the histories of colonizers, lost tribes, primitive cultures, pagan wanderers, but they were none of those things. They were protectors of the original flame. Even today, you can trace their path. In Haiti, where Vodou chants echo old Sahel invocations. In Brazil, where candomblé spirits wear the names of gods erased elsewhere. In the American South, where gospel music trembles with rhythms that predate slave ships. All of this survival masked as surrender. Faith hidden in migration, God carried in the soul, not in the book. And why was this story left out of scripture? Because it didn't center on obedience. It centered on remembrance, and remembered people are hard to control. Ombatha was not a jealous god. He was a god of keeping on, of knowing your name even when no one else does, of making sure the spark never goes out, no matter how dark the world becomes. So when you feel the urge to move, to shift, to walk away from a system that no longer honors you, that might not be rebellion, that might be exodus. And this time, you won't need a prophet to part the sea, because the God who walks with you already knows the way. You've heard of burning books, but what they really wanted was to burn memory. They built bonfires out of scrolls that sang the names of black gods. They called it purification. They raided temples and lit up altars that had survived centuries, not because those gods were weak, but because they were too strong to ignore. When they couldn't silence them with steel, they tried fire. And yet, the fire never did what they wanted. Because black divinity was born in heat, it thrived in flame. There's an ancient legend from Mali about a god named Tuzari, the flame that learns. He wasn't a destroyer, he was a revealer. His fire didn't consume blindly, it exposed what was hidden, illuminated what was denied, and purified without shame. His temples were not made of stone, but of embers. His worship didn't happen with chance, but with truth. It was said that if you stood in Tuzari's flame and spoke a lie, it would turn cold. Only truth could stay warm. That's what terrified the invaders most. Not the rituals, not the masks, not the dance. The truth. Because truth that burns through illusion can't be colonized. When European missionaries arrived in West Africa, they heard whispers of Tuzari. They saw his symbols carved into drums and fire pits. They watched as people danced barefoot around flame, speaking in tongues no outsider could translate. And they knew this fire had to be put out, but you can't burn what already is fire. So they tried to mimic it. Stained glass windows glowing like flame, sermons full of holy fire, revival tents that stole the rhythm but stripped the root. Still, Tuzari endured not in name, but in spark. He's there in the preacher who accidentally starts telling the truth mid-sermon, in the grandmother who burns sage while reciting the Psalms, in the child who sets their life on fire not with violence, but with knowing. Tuzari doesn't care about recognition, he cares about ignition. And the reason black fire still scares the world, because it refuses to be tamed. It shows up in protests that become sacred, in art that makes people squirm, in love that survives the unthinkable. The flame you carry isn't metaphor, it's memory. It's sacred inheritance. It's the peace of God they never wanted you to find again. So the next time you feel that burning in your chest, that heat in your bones, don't put it out. Don't apologize for it. Don't mistake it for rage or rebellion. It might be Tuzari, reminding you that the fire they tried to extinguish still burns in you. They banned the drums for a reason. In plantations, in colonies, in missionized villages, wherever the people were forced to forget, the drum was the first thing silenced. It wasn't just an instrument. It was a map, a language, a weapon, and a god. Because before the sermon, there was rhythm. Before the written word, there was pulse. And before the name Jesus reached the shores of Africa, there was Ngolo, the god of the living beat. Ngolo didn't live in the sky or on a mountaintop. He lived inside sound. His presence was not visual, but visceral, felt in the sternum, in the spine, in the soles of your feet. He didn't speak in sentences. He spoke in sequences. His worship was movement. His commandment was syncopation. To follow Ngolo wasn't to kneel. It was to move in rhythm with truth. He was the god who taught warriors to duck at the right moment, who helped midwives time the contractions with heartbeat-like claps, who whispered strategy into the hands of drummers during tribal negotiations. When Ngolo was near, people didn't shout. They listened to the beat. But when the invaders came, they knew the danger. They saw how the drum could summon memory, how it could ignite resistance without a single word, how one rhythm, repeated in the right way, could awaken a whole village's divinity. So they called it savage. They outlawed it, smashed drums, cut hands, burned dancers alive. And still the rhythm survived, in coded footwork on plantations, in gospel claps that carried forgotten cadences, in jazz, hip-hop, reggaeton, the rebirth of Ngolo, in every genre they said was too black. Even now, when someone says, "That beat moves me," they're speaking a spiritual truth, because it's not just music, it's inheritance, it's resistance wrapped in bass. You may not know the old rhythms, but your body does. Why do you think it feels holy to dance, even when there's no prayer? Why do you think the heart accelerates when the beat drops? Why do tears rise during a drum solo that hits just right? Because the gods they buried in books still live in sound. And Ngolo? He's not waiting for a revival. He's been here under the floorboards of every church, behind the beat of every protest chant, inside the hum that rises when black voices sing together. He doesn't want you to memorize doctrine. He wants you to remember the rhythm. So when the music hits and you feel your body rising before your mind can catch up, let it. That's not rebellion. That's recognition. Because no matter how much they tried to erase it, the drumbeat outlived the doctrine. There was a prayer once. No books, no rosaries, no foreign tongue. Just breath, vibration, intention. It didn't ask for forgiveness. It didn't beg for favor. It activated something. It aligned the soul with the sky, the soil, and the self. This prayer was passed not through priests, but grandmothers. Not in churches, but during childbirth, over meals, in the quiet moments before sleep. It was felt more than spoken. And when it was spoken, it was always the same rhythm, the same breath, the same sequence, because it wasn't a phrase. It was a code. It was called Nakashi, the remembering word. You didn't say it to change your reality. You said it to return to it. It was the first word whispered into the ears of newborns in ancient Angola, the last word spoken over the dying in Nubian burial grounds. It was a sonic key, one that reminded the soul of its origin, its purpose, its path. It was prayer not as plea, but as reminder. So, of course, they silenced it. The colonizers weren't afraid of language. They were afraid of unlocking, of a people who could pray without intermediaries, who didn't need cathedrals to access the divine, who carried the sacred not in books, but in their own mouths. So the remembering word was outlawed, whispered only in the dark, hidden in songs, buried in names, distorted by fear. Over time, even the people who carried it forgot what it meant. They kept the rhythm, the syllables, the melody, but not the memory, until one day, a child hummed it while drawing symbols in the dirt, a melody their parents never taught them, a pattern that made no sense to the mind, but felt ancient in the body. And just like that, the prayer awakened. Because memory doesn't die, it sleeps. And the gods they tried to kill are just waiting for someone to remember the sound of their names. Nakashi is still here, in the silence between two breaths, in the chorus of a song you don't know how you know, in the syllable that escapes your lips when you're in pain but feel protected, in the dream where you speak fluently in a language you've never heard. You've been praying without knowing, not to their gods, to yours. So the next time you find yourself repeating a phrase, a hum, a name that makes no logical sense, don't dismiss it. Listen to it. Say it again. Because the prayer you were never meant to remember never stopped remembering you. Some pastors don't know who they really are, not because they're dishonest, but because their story was cut in half before they were born. They stand at the pulpit, tie tight, Bible open, preaching about a God they were taught to fear and obey. But sometimes their voice trembles, not from nerves, from something deeper, something older. Because the truth is, many of them are descended from oracles, from seer women who could taste a lie in the air, from healers who knew which plant could cure the spirit, not just the body, from keepers of the threshold, those who once guarded the line between this world and the unseen. But none of that made it into their seminary textbooks, because it wasn't Christian enough. It wasn't safe enough, so it was buried. You see, in many African diasporic bloodlines, especially those shaped by colonization, slavery, and forced conversion, sacred lineage wasn't erased. It was disguised. The grandmother who made you rub your chest 3 times before leaving the house, not superstition, a protection ritual. The uncle who never stepped foot in a church but talked to the moon like it was his friend, not madness. Inheritance. These were fragments, scattered pages from a holy book they never let you read, and the pulpit ironically became one of the safest places to hide what remained, because the system didn't question you if you were preaching the right scriptures. You could have visions, speak in tongues, feel the ancestors moving through you as long as you wrapped it in chapter and verse. So that's what many did. They became men of God. But the God they served was wearing a mask, not a false God, a disguised one with the voice of the river, the gaze of the stars, the rhythm of the drum, the same gods their great-grandmothers had called by name in secret. This is why so many sermons feel like fire, not because of theology, because something beneath the theology is waking up. And some pastors know. They see visions they can't explain. They lay hands and feel energies they never studied. They open their mouths and words pour out that aren't from any sermon notes. That's not just passion, that's bloodline memory breaking through the page. The church may have given them a platform, but the gods gave them a purpose. So the next time you hear a preacher who doesn't just speak, but channels, listen closely, not to the words, to the energy underneath. You might just be hearing an old God speaking through new language, because some pulpits weren't built for control. They were built as altars to a forgotten lineage waking up inside its own disguise. By now, you feel it, not just in your mind, but in your skin, in your breath, in the quiet tremble behind your ribs. This wasn't just a history lesson. This was a reminder. You were never meant to forget. Not the names, not the rhythms, not the gods that once walked beside you, not above you. They erased the stories. They burned the temples. They renamed your gods and told you to pray to strangers. But the sacred doesn't need a name to survive. It needs you to remember, to recognize. When you sang as a child without knowing the language that was memory, when you danced without choreography but felt something sacred that was alignment, when you looked into the night sky and felt both infinite and known that was them, the gods, the ancestors, the truth they tried to bury beneath centuries of dogma. You were told divinity was something you had to earn, that it came with rules, that it had a hierarchy. But the black gods you descended from didn't require obedience, they required presence. They didn't ask for belief, they asked for remembrance. And here you are, still breathing, still burning, still carrying codes in your blood that even you don't fully understand. They tried to convince you your power was a myth, that your blackness was a burden, not a blessing, that your ancestral wisdom was demonic, that your dreams were just dreams. But here's the truth. Your existence is not a mistake. It's a continuation. You are not the end of a story. You are the return of one. And every time you ask questions they don't want answered, Every time you challenge what they told you was sacred. Every time you feel a presence and know it's not from any holy book they gave you. That's not rebellion. That's remembrance. The secret was never that the black gods were evil. The secret was that they were yours, that they were you, and that if you remembered them fully, you'd never need anyone's permission to be divine again. So light your candle. Speak the word that comes to your lips before thought. Feel the drumbeat in your chest. Walk into the sacred like you belong there because you always have. The gods are not coming back. They never left. They were simply waiting for you to come home.